Okay, so this week we're going to explain or to tackle in some detail the topic of the political outsiders, and we're going to investigate the context within which political outsiders emerged, basically in Venezuela and Ecuador, and what are the main features of the political regime they tried to establish, and whether or not the main evaluation, whether or not these political outsiders with their anti-establishment discourse and with their participatory democracy element, whether or not they offered an alternative to the paradigm of liberal representative democracy, or there is kind of a trade-off between different elements within these populist models. So we'll start out with Ecuador and then Venezuela, and we kind of build on what we mentioned last week about the indigenous movement in Ecuador and the neoliberal context that actually, or the environment that actually hinged on the capacity of indigenous population and indigenous organizations and their trans community networks in order to mobilize against particular presidents and to be one of the main pivotal player at the national level or in the political landscape in Ecuador, starting from the early 90s. So the process in Ecuador actually culminated into the emergence of a political outsider, Rafael Correa, in 2006, after after several waves of nationwide mass demonstrations that helped to overthrow two presidents, and actually they didn't cause or they didn't affect the impeachment of the third president, Correa, Gutierrez, but actually they helped with their mobilization to mobilize against him as well, or to fit into this institutional crisis that actually Gutierrez faced during his mandate. Again, the context within which Correa emerged as the credible political outsider appealed to wide masses with his anti-elitist and anti-establishment discourse. So generally speaking, there's debate in the literature between different two main streams about identity-based explanations or structure and or political opportunity structures that helped social movements to emerge. So we explained in some detail, and we looked deeply into this anecdotal evidence or the anecdotal account of the emergence of Indian or the heightening of this Indianness as an identity in Ecuador, and how with the help of some, or with building on their organizational capacity, they managed to mobilize at the national and to scale up the struggle at the national level. So here, or this week, we are trying to tackle this from a slightly different angle, and still from another stream in the literature that actually focus on this interaction between the opportunity structure, the political opportunity structure that actually, with the political opening and with the emergence of by offering or guaranteeing constitutional and legal rights for freedom of associations and freedom of speech, and how different actors invested in these opportunities in order to build their reservoir or repertoire of contention. And in a piecemeal fashion, they escalated their demands by articulating different grievances all the time, or in different, waves of protest. This actually created repertoire of contention or cultural reservoir to build on, and then to have like a coherent discourse which was appealing. This discourse was appealing to wide masses. So how like these kind of contentious practices throughout the 90s, with the help of this neoliberal turn and political opening, interacted, in a way or another, in order to offer ready-made electoral constituencies for political outsiders to tap into in order to reach power, basically Korea in 2006. So again, like the macro context or the environment that actually helped with the emergence of the political outsider in Ecuador, it was again the neoliberal shift or the neoliberal turn. Yashar actually offered again this kind of interactive account between political opportunity structure and the organizational capacity, and how they together helped indigenous population to mobilize or to invest or to build on their trans community or pre-existing networks, dense networks, in order to escalate their mobilization. So here, within this framework, the neoliberal turn and the political mobilization of indigenous population and the formation of ethnic parties in Ecuador, although they did, unlike Bolivia, they didn't manage to reach power at the national level, but they contested electorally at the local, at the parliamentary elections and at the local elections as well, and they managed to get some seats or some sort of representation. But here again, the environment or the atmosphere they created, or the repertoire they built throughout the 90s, discredited the existing political establishment and enabled political outsider to appeal to the pre-existing disgruntled or disaffected masses in order to assume power in 2006. So Ecuador, unlike other like populist nationalist regime during import substitution industrialization that actually enabled labor-based parties to emerge in other countries. We talked about Bolivia, Chile, Argentina. Unlike these countries, Ecuador actually witnessed belated industrialization, import substitution industrialization effort. So that's why it lagged, this is strong labor-based movement or labor-based parties and labor confederation that actually had like high mobilizing capacity. So the heritage or the legacy was kind of weak nationalist populist appeal during the import substitution industrialization, although like this kind of it followed the same path of popular incorporation and far-reaching redistributive policies that actually managed to incorporate, peasants and workers or laborers into corporatist arrangements. But the most or the strongest, player the most important player in Ecuador came from the indigenous networks or the indigenous population. But and the actually with their mobilization, they attracted some trade union or labor confederation to join in, and they together managed to block the advance of neoliberal policies or market-oriented policies, and basically privatization and concessions to foreign firms for offering concessions, for multinational companies or corporations in order to penetrate the indigenous lands. So they started when the economic crisis actually hit hard. So presidents and political leaders, they had to implement these neoliberal policies or market reform measures. So they started again roughly in the mid 80s with Febres Cordero and then Borja Ceballos. And the crisis started to emerge and to escalate, under the reign of Duran Balen, and then the three presidents, Bukaram, Mahmoud, and Gutierrez. So actually, indigenous population, as I mentioned last lecture, they started to gain like a strong boost in 1990, when they actually took to the streets and forced the government to negotiate, actually obliged the government after launching this nationwide strikes, and different segments in society and different sectors actually joined the protest and the strike, and actually they put everything on hold, all the economic activities. So it was a complete kind of economic shutdown. So that's why they forced and obliged the government to negotiate with them. And ever since, they have become one of the important, the most important political actor in Ecuador. So what happened with the intensification and the escalation of the crisis under Bukaram? When like populist leaders campaigned on populist economic program, and then when they reached office, they had to be much more realistic and to approach the international financial institutions in order to proceed with the neoliberal reform measures. So they supported Bukaram initially in order to implement or to introduce this kind of radical social and economic reform programs, and to reverse the neoliberal policies initiated by past administrations. And when he reached power, he actually he turned on his electoral promises, and he had to implement these economic liberalization measures. So they felt betrayed, by Bukaram, and they started to organize mobilization against him that eventually removed him from power less than a year from taking office in 1996. So, and then Mahmoud, assumed power after him, and he actually implemented even more aggressive economic program. So again, they organized, their struggle in coordination with Convention for Migratory Speeches. Emerged as one of the powerful confederation or association for of labor unions or labor confederations that actually coalesced or built like a patriotic front with the CONE, the Indigenous National Confederation in Ecuador, and they together they reached out to different social movements and indigenous movements in order to form a patriotic alliance to marshal or to master, effort and to increase their strength in the face of the existing elites and political and traditional political parties or establishment. So they managed to mobilize against Mahmoud, and they forced him to back down ultimately. Gutierrez actually participated in this like popular and indigenous uprisings against Mahmoud, and emerged as a populist leaders, and later campaigned on a populist platform in order to reach power and to appeal to the indigenous population. And actually he had like kind of a political deal with in the Indigenous Confederation by allocating some ministerial posts to indigenous people. But what happened with Gutierrez as well, he turned on his electoral promises, and after reaching power, he had to approach the IMF in order to have like an economic agreement in order to stabilize the economy. But again, with the case of with Gutierrez case, actually he lacked legislative majority. So the Christian Democrats supported him in some policies, but actually they opposed him in another. He lacked like a stable coalition in the parliament or in the legislature in order to push through his policy program or his policy agenda. So mainly his partisan alliances and shifting, this unraveling of a weak legislative coalition led to um, his removal from power eventually, not necessarily the mobilization of the indigenous people, but actually the indigenous confederation and the indigenous movements mobilized against Gutierrez as well. So with this with this context of different waves of protest, so protesters or early risers actually accumulated what the literature would say this cultural frames or different meanings and different signification assigned to the existing political and social order. And it offered these kind of political impeachment and the struggle between the executive and the parliament and the lack of the majority, legislative majority, that actually weakened the president's and the policy agenda of the executive or the president's initiative to implement economic and social policies. With this context and with this kind of master frame or with this kind of cultural repertoire of contention, all like indigenous and social movements coordinated efforts in order to create an environment that is hostile towards the existing elites and the existing political establishment. And as we mentioned last week, the Pachakutik movement, actually they formed their own party and they coordinated efforts with the CMS citizen movement for the new country. They together they managed to coordinate or to have like a contingent alliance in elections in order to maximize their seats in the legislature and in the at the local level as well. And they together draw on dense coordinating networks of social movements that created this vibrant environment of contentious practices and disruptive politics that actually enabled Correa as an unknown political technocrat to campaign on a populist platform and to capitalize on this anti-Gutierrez demonstrations or anti-Gutierrez protests, and in order to appeal to these wide masses and eventually to reach power in 2006 and to win the elections in 2006. So Gutierrez actually for a short period he was a minister of economy, and he captured the imagination of the citizens with his hostile posture towards the IMF when they negotiated, free trade agreement, and the negotiated terms of economic terms of economic agreements. So he actually became widely known for his opposition to this dependent neoliberal economy and the dependency on the West or on the US, and as an unknown politician or technocrat, he managed in a way to play into these wide anger or rising and growing anger against the political establishment in order to organize his electoral campaign on some populist elements or some elements of populist discourse. So actually he built his campaign, he had this slogan of citizens revolution in 2006, and actually it led the groundwork for his transformative project. So he actually he failed to have solid and strong alliance with the existing leftist forces, including the indigenous party, but some elements that defected from the Indian party or the indigenous movement, the indigenous party, they actually supported and they participated actively in his electoral campaign, and some leftists and some activists. And eventually he had like this loose alliance of País Patria, or the Country Alliance, and later Country Accord. He built on the existing, anger and resentful feelings toward the traditional political parties and the traditional political elites. And he actually, his campaign, he exposed himself and projected the image of this humanist Christian of the left. And he claimed moral superiority by lashing out at almost everything in the in the existing that actually evoke this economic dependency and triggered this or perpetuated the existence of the corrupt elite and the corruption of the political institutions in the country. So he had like this slogan, like clean hands, lucid minds, and hearts passionate for the homeland. And he borrowed some catchy phrases like homeland returns from like existing literature novelists, and some sayings of national intellectuals there. So this is actually tried to magnify or to amplify his populist discourse by claiming this religious and moral superiority, and to give credit to his anti-corruption and anti-establishment elements or foundation of his discourse. And he lashed out as well at the existing political party or partiarchy, partidocratia, like the existing, the traditional or the well entrenched and well established political parties that actually fail to deliver on their electoral promises or any kind of social and economic demands for the wide masses. So the economic program or some economic policies occupied central position in his electoral and policy program. Again, like the nationalism, patriotism, and dignity of the nation or of the homeland played important and central role as well, and fighting against corruption as well. Like three important pillars in his electoral and policy electoral campaign and electoral platform that actually managed enabled him to attract wide masses or to appeal to broader electoral constituents. For the economy, he actually promised. He was inspired by Chavez, like 21st century socialism, but he actually slowed down the process, or he didn't promise, this far-reaching nationalization program. So what he actually promised kind of mixed economy, and this is what he actually implemented after reaching power. So he promised like pay increase, or the like increasing in the salaries of the public sector employees. He promised to re-establish subsidies, state subsidies, and welfare assistance programs, especially for marginalized people. And he promised to extend microcredit loans in order to support small business enterprises. He had like one of the competitors that actually he led like the electoral polls until the first half of 2006 in order to outbid Nobwa. He actually campaigned on the same like social and economic program and attracted like promised redistributive policies. He promised as well this kind of welfare assistance programs in order to attract the marginalized and the poor people, and to maximize the votes from these electoral constituencies But actually, in order to outbid him, he tried to put an emphasis on these social and economic programs alongside this moral superiority, because like the Nobu as well, he actually played into this religious discourse or religious sentiments, using, like, the Bible in his hands, and trying to attack Korea as an agent of Chavez and communism, and try to destroy the country. And actually, this discourse or this attack was used by Korea in order to throw it back, to his electoral rival or competitor, by saying this is kind of an assault on the poor, like in cynical, actually, assault on the people's brain and people's mind. And he tried actually to manipulate the poor people there. But actually, like Bukaram's party and Roldosistas actually supported his competitor, and one of the main, or lack of partisan support, Gutierrez party and the rightist, actually the Christian Democrats, refused to back any of the presidential candidates. So one of the main weaknesses of Korea during his electoral campaign, his lack of like a solid electoral alliance, that in order to enable him to reach out to broader electoral constituencies, unlike his electoral competitor. So he actually played on this populist discourse, alongside like discrediting the existing political establishment with their support for his electoral competitor. And eventually he won the runoff by almost like 57% of the national vote. But again, he lagged one of the main feature of the political system in Ecuador is the lack of the legislative majority that actually led to the impeachment of previous presidents. So that was the case, with Korea as well, because he lacked, any like legislative majority. With the lack of this solid partisan support, and with the support of this loose alliance of political activists and some defectors from social movements, and this dense and loose networks of social movements, he didn't run on a clear slate of he didn't propose any kind of his candidates for the parliamentary elections. That was like one of the disadvantages, that this actually weakened his position as a president, and increased the probability of the impeachment, or to have like a gridlock with the legislature, with Congress. But on the positive side, this lack of partisan support as well increased, his credential as an outsider, or increased, the confidence in his anti-establishment discourse, and actually it appealed to voters with this anti-political stand or anti-political sentiments. So this enabled him to win the elections eventually within the runoff in the second round. But as he mentioned, after like winning, the presidential elections, he actually stated that we won the elections, but not power, because he did know quite well that he lacked like the legislative majority, and there was high probability to get impeached like his predecessors. One of the central pillar in his electoral campaign was this promise of the new writing a new constitution. So and he portrayed this as the mother of all the battles, and he considered this as like a stepping stone towards increasing his presidential power or increasing the authority of the executive in the face of the legislature, or in order to have control over other state institutions, in order to preclude or to preempt, any attempt of his impeachment. So lacking like solid support or solid partisan coalition, he depended heavily on popular demonstrations and mass and top-down mobilization as a populist outsider. He counted mainly on this mass mobilization and mass demonstrations in order to push for his policy program. But as I mentioned, one of his first concerns was writing the new constitution. In order to write a new constitution, he had to elect a new constituent assembly. So what happened, as I mentioned last week, they had like with this intense and continuing indigenous mobilization throughout the 90s, they forced the state actors in order to write a new constitution, and the indigenous population participated in the new in the constituent assembly that were in the assembly that actually was in charge of amending and writing the new constitution. But actually, they were dissatisfied. The indigenous movements, they were dissatisfied with even like the new amendments and the new articles in the constitutions that actually granted them cultural autonomy. But the constitution actually didn't introduce like radical economic reforms that they actually aspired for. So that's why Korea depended or played on this and promised, a new homeland and a new constitution with this citizens' revolution, as like writing a new constitution would be the first step in order to have this transformative constitutional project. So he lacked this kind of strong backing in Congress, so that's why he had to make sure that he had the majority in the new Constituent Assembly, and that was not possible with this initial lacking of congressional majority or solid legislative coalition in Congress. So he turned to the National Electoral Tribunal in order to remove opponent legislators, in order to get rid of them. So he had to play them against to play them off against, to pit them off against each other. So the National Electoral Tribunal actually removed dissidents or inside Congress because of the obstruction of the election of the new Constituent Assembly. And again, when they resorted to the Constitutional Court, now he replaced, the opponents in Congress with supporters. So they managed actually to dismiss the judges that actually ruling against the removal decision. So he started to have control over key institutions, and that was like essential for populist outsiders in order to sustain their power, and then to build, or to extend their support base, social support base. So now having like majority in Congress or in the legislature, so the like more than 80% of the legislators voted in favor of holding elections of the new Constituent Assembly to write a new constitution. And with the new Constituent Assembly, they had Korea and his supporters, they had the majority, almost more than 61% of the seats, 80 out of 130 seats. And he eventually, it was like writing a new constitution was a crucial step for Korea in order to sustain and consolidate and establish his authority or his power as a president. So first thing, he had to extend, the prerogatives, the constitutional prerogatives, of the executive. So first of all, the new constitution enabled him to almost have referenda on almost all the matters that like this would help him to actually to trump or to circumvent any kind of legislative opponents. So constitutionally, as an outsider, they resorted to plebiscites in order to pass their policy agenda. So now he can like bypass the parliament or Congress in order to implement and to pass his laws and policy agenda. The constitution as well gave him another weapon that he had, like constitutionally, he had the right to dissolve, the parliament or the legislature once during his term in office. And again, he controlled even the appointment to the legislature and the judicial branch by creating this new state agency, Transparency and Social Council. He had control over, and his supporters, he had control over this council that has been like, or has become in charge of appointing to state agencies. So he established, control over like a state, some of the key state institutions in order to enable him to govern smoothly without facing any resistance from his opponents inside the state institutions. And they again, like he campaigned on this mixed economy, and he implemented this after reaching power. So he restored state control over some strategic sectors, especially renewable natural resources and hydrocarbon sectors, transportation and telecommunication. And actually he offended, some multinational corporations that had like some concessions and privileges in while working, in the country. He promised again like socialism like Chavez, but he didn't radicalize, he didn't overuse nationalization measures or expropriation and confiscation of some of the private enterprises and private sector resources. But again, he had like some antagonistic relationship with big business associations, especially in oil sector. And he repeatedly like insulted them or depicted them as gangsters that actually they didn't care about, the wealth of the nation or the pride and the dignity of the nation, but they did care more about accumulating their wealth by approaching or by being dependent on the U.S. or the foreign corporations and foreign companies. So he tried to impose like harsher terms on multinational corporations working, especially in the oil sectors, in order to be like service providers and to transfer some or greater revenues to the national treasury, or to be part of the state revenues. So he actually imposed some harsher measures or some harsher terms in order to increase, the national revenues of the natural resources. But at the same time, he had like this confusing and bewildering relationship with the indigenous population, because although he played into, or he repeatedly actually stressed, this discourse of participatory democracy, but he didn't actually, when it comes to active participation or bottom-up mobilization, he showed some sort of anger, and he undertook some policies in a more assertive direction. for two reasons. He actually he had some fears or worried about this fragmentation by giving too much power to indigenous population, although he established like a ministry or a secretary for El Pueblo, or the people and social movements, but he actually heavily depended on this top-down approach rather than bottom-up mobilization and the cooptation of the leaders of these social movements in order not to get like too much veto authority or veto power, especially on some of the economic decisions regarding the natural resources, exploration of the natural resources, because they needed to get some sort of autonomy over their lands, and to have like they had like this um, um, sense of xenophobia against foreign firms like penetrating their lands in order to explore for natural resources. So he actually needed to neutralize them with regard, in order not to have any kind of say in this economic, especially in economic decisions. And on the other hand, he had like some worries regarding the fragmentation of the nation. So that's why he deployed this rhetoric of active participation, but at the same time, or effectively, when it comes to actual policies, he depended mainly on cooptation and top-down approach when it comes to mobilizing social movements, and most especially the indigenous movements. And as I mentioned, during the after like the late 90s, the indigenous movements actually lacked the same collective power they had during the early 90s, because in public eyes, actually they replicated the same kind of like elitist, or when they played politics. So they actually they didn't see any kind of difference, or they didn't differentiate between the indigenous party and the existing traditional parties when it comes to playing politics or getting involved into political processes and political dynamics. So they heightened this ethnic identity on the one hand, and on the other hand, by playing politics and having supporting some political candidates, and playing politics within with the same rules of the game before Korea. So this actually discredited their anti-establishment or anti-elitist discourse. And after Korea, actually Korea played on this, and he actually tried to divide the movement by co-opting, their the indigenous movements and indigenous confederations, by co-opting their leaders and adopting this controlling them from above. So he further weakened the basis or the organizational capacity of the movement in order to escalate any kind of national to escalate the struggle at the national level. So we highlighted, the context or the origin of the Korea's movement or Korea's populist discourse, and the main features like the economic element and the dignity or patriotism, and like the constitution, or the anti-establishment or anti-establishment discourse, or fighting against corruption. They were like the main three elements or three features in his policy programs, and he implemented them after reaching power. And this enabled him with the new constitution, actually enabled the president to get re-elected in a consecutive term, so that he got re-elected by implementing this. This raised the approval rating and the confidence in his presidency, and he got re-elected. But when it comes to the evaluation of his participatory democracy paradigm or model, so again, like political outsiders and populist leaders, they had the established as a model, actually, leaders, populist leaders and outsiders, in order to penetrate, to have access to centers of powers. So they have to establish their control over state institutions. So he actually, through a mix of legal engineering and manipulating different factions and different political parties against each other, he actually gained control over state institutions, and he wrote the new constitution that enabled constitutionally and legally the executive to have excessive constitutional power in relation to other branches of the government. And when it comes to this, like his support base and his participatory democracy, or radical democratic discourse, he actually adopted this co-optation measure and top-down approach in order not to give too much power or too much veto power, especially to the indigenous at the most or the strongest, political actor there. So he actually tried to control them and to further weaken their organizational basis, and and their fragmented political discourse as well. So by having like alternative political, all-encompassing, political discourse that focus on national pride, patriotism, moral superiority, co-opting, activist and indigenous parties that they are not part of his ruling alliance or contingent alliance, he had his own conception of a participatory democracy that actually had limited boundaries in a way or another. And whether or not he offered an alternative to this representative and liberal paradigm, it will be like an open question. And we can talk more about this when we finish, what happened in Venezuela, especially after Chavez, and the repercussions or consequences of this kind of populist discourse and the institutionalization and personalization of the authority, the repercussions or consequences for the institutional configurations, especially after the death or the departure of the populist leaders. So it had some sort of dangerous implications for the institutional parameters or institutional configurations in the country, especially after the departure of their charismatic and personal leaders. So in Venezuela, the context was, back again to neoliberalism and bad economic performance and brand dilution. It was like a total collapse of the two AD and COPE. So it was like entire collapse of the two main political parties that they had long actually dominated the political landscape. Even like during this slow process of party system collapse, Chavez, as I mentioned like 3 weeks ago, he actually tried. He made like a failed coup attempt in 1992. Well, there's like brief appearance on the TV, like citizens or the public, got to know him. And his movement, as we're going to see, established or gained penetration in society by the late 90s. When he ran for elections, he actually assumed power through the electoral contestation. So his movement of the Fifth Republic of Bolivarian revolutionary movement, he reached power in 1998, but it had origins since the early 80s, and it emerged actually from within the military establishment. So it had like some military origins, and leftist inclination when it comes to the policy programs and participatory democracy discourse. So his movement, Bolivarian Revolutionary Movement 200, actually emerged in the military or inside the military establishment in the in the early 80s, and these officers that participated or created the movement, they actually they had like this. They took pride in the legacy of Simon Bolivar. Army of Liberation, so they invoked, this memory of the role of the Bolivarian Liberation Army. So they took pride in this liberating mission of the army or the military in Latin America, and they depicted themselves as heirs of the Bolivarian Army of Liberation. So they had again like this kind of patriotic and nationalist values or sentiments. And again, they take pride in this military career or military establishment. So the civil-military alliance was one of the central component in Chavez during Chavez rule. And again, fight against corruption, this disillusionment with the existing establishment or the traditional political parties. So they actually, as a movement, or later as a political outsider, he actually asserted and emphasized this patriotism and nationalism and the role of them here. One other element, because he coming from the military, he portrayed this great military greatness of the military career or the military establishment, the role of the military in liberation, or in even initiating economic and nationalist development strategies, especially inherited from the era of the import substitution industrialization, and then drawing on the wide disillusionment or disenchantment with the existing political establishment. So they had to emphasize or to frame the issue of the corruption in order to appeal to the wide masses. And they actually started, it was like a secret movement inside the military, but they approached actually some civilian militants in order to get some sort of penetration or support in society. So one of the militants or civilian militants that supported the movement, and some of them, they had impact on its orientation towards participatory decentralization and participatory democracy. It was the Venezuelan Revolutionary Party as a splinter from the Communist Party, and then La Causa, our party, and the Socialist League. La Causa, our party, and the Socialist League, they had they belonged more to this kind of revisionist trend within the communist camp or the leftist camp, that they actually repudiated the use of violence in order to achieve any political outcomes, or as a mean in order to achieve political goals. And they had some sort of influence on the movement, when it reached power, by enabling it to endorse this participatory democracy model and this repudiation of the violence. And then after the failed coup, actually, and he got detained, and then with the presidential pardon, Chavez got released after roughly 2 years. And the movement actually started to get penetration into different and it got it appealed to wide masses or wide social bases that enabled the MBR to transform itself into electoral structure or electoral organization in order to organize its electoral campaign and to disseminate its political platform. So they created, this the Fifth Republic MVR, that actually centered on Chavez as a person, or Chavez personality, or as a charismatic leader. So it had like this vertical and loose, vertical and centralized structure. But when it comes to the ideology, because it gathered, different civilian elements, or different militants from like civilians and from military background. So ideologically, it was like heterogeneous. So any kind of attempt to transform the movement into a mass party with like rigid hierarchical structure and wide support base, and with local branches and collective leadership, never materialized because of this kind of heterogeneous ideological predispositions and orientations, and the heavy dependence on Chavez as a charismatic leadership. So he had to mediate, or to resolve all the disputes. So the movement actually was predicated on his personality or his charisma, in order to articulate, the policy programs, and to resolve any internal disputes. And they didn't have like this void, or like empty kind of nationalist discourse. So they didn't have this instill this nationalist sentiments and hyper nationalist discourse in order to attract voters, or in order to build extensive social bases. But they had like they juxtaposed this nationalist discourse, or nationalism and patriotism, along with nationalist developmentalist ideas. So in order to push Venezuela to be a regional power, in order to increase its economic power, or to improve its economic position. So they had to, like the movement and Chavez, they had to implement some sort of developmental policies that is like development from within, to indigenize without any sort of dependency on the West or international financial institutions. So they had to push for growth, and alongside increased productivity, in order to increase the economic, or to improve the economic position, or to have this nationalist development strategy or ideals that would improve, the economic position, and the elevate, Venezuela as a regional one of the or as a regional power in Latin America. So it all depended on the origins from the military, and then reaching out or approachment with civilian militants, that later, they had some sort of disagreement over, or disputes over strategies and tactics with Chavez in 2001, 2002, as we are going to see. But these are like military origins, proclivities, towards leftist policy and economic programs, reaching out to some civilian militants, but all like depended on, although it had like electoral structure and vertical and centralized structure, but it depended mainly and heavily on the personality of Chavez. So one of the demerit or disadvantages of this is like increasing internal disputes by counting heavily on the personal authority of someone, and lacking any sort of institutional mechanisms that would resolve or channel these confrontations and disputes. It became like salient in 2000, like after 2 or 3 years into his presidency, this confrontation not only with his like outsider opponents, but from his own alliance or his own like patriotic front. So he actually he had like this strategy of fusing, all the political parties into one socialist and single party, and this triggered resistance and challenges from his partners of his own coalition. So this actually created tensions and pushed for internal factions, and pushed for partisan factions within his front or within his political alliance. So Podemos actually defected or split from the movement to socialism in 2001, and although it remained or it continued to support Chavez as a president, it moved actually to the opposition camp in 2007. That was like another turning point with his attempt to amend or to introduce radical constitutional reforms in 2007. And then the fatherland for everyone, part PPT, a splinter from La Causa R in 1997, and actually formed in 1997. It actually, the party broke with Chavez in 2007. So actually, like there is like a negative side of depending on personal authority, even like or personal authority to resolve any and not institutionalizing conflict resolution mechanisms. It had its own disadvantages, even with the existence of this person or charismatic leadership, let alone, or not to mention, after his departure, it led to like entire deterioration of the institutional configuration. So with this like intense confrontation with his opposition, and again like the confrontation from the right wingers or conservative forces, and this deepening social polarization in 2001, 2002, it actually pushed Chavez, towards a more assertive direction, and he tried to radicalize even more the Bolivarian project. Where I leave it off, but and pick it up again next time from there. But briefly, he resorted mainly to the military that had like a strong presence in the public administration, and then he proceeded with this harsh socialist measures that actually triggered more hostility and social polarization between his opponents and supporters. So we are going to see or to examine like the consequences, what actually the main features of his socialist project and participatory democracy model, and what kind of steps he took in order to transform the society, and then the implications or the assessment of his model in Venezuelan political system and society at large, and the repercussions after his departure. Okay, so that's all for today, and see you next time. Bye.